Sutterer.
So this is the most narrow room I've ever spoken in. It's like, it feels like there is 4 different rooms in one, and I can't even recognize people in the very back, but hello! So I'm really sorry. I wanted to have this amazing cover slide, and I had a really good idea, but something happened last night. And I also didn't win any chess games to like talk about. I also didn't bring any beers, so the only thing I have, like, I opened my laptop this morning and it said like 2:05 a.m. and I googled for time in Ukraine and then backslash, so I couldn't even type anymore properly. But yeah, so this is my opening screen. I'm talking about Enterprise Ruby. Since I don't, we said don't touch it if it works. It actually only works partly because, hey, you clicked and you shouldn't click because it's, this is the slide. So I'm actually spoiling Ivan Nevijensko's talk because he has this really funny, the way Rails evolved or something, this chart, and I'm part of this chart. I don't want to spoil it. This is why I removed all the information. So I'm really proud to be in a chart with my project, my Trailblazer project, and there's also the word beer in it, so it's pretty accurate. I'm actually really looking forward to your talk. Just giving you some ideas about the Trailblazer core team. So we've been doing enterprise, business-oriented software since 1981. So we stand for Rails or Ruby first. This is us when we started Trailblazer a couple of years ago. Actually, like 5 years ago. If you can spot me in that image, I'll buy you drinks tonight. If you can't spot me, I will probably buy you drinks anyway. Okay, so to come back to Ivan's talk. So there's I don't know if I'm spoiling anything, but so he basically will talk about Rails sucks and how people go to discover different paths to solve problems that are in Rails, and how they find their way to solve their problems. So my problem was that when I started Ruby, I got really intrigued by the idea of Rails and active record, and I mean I still like a lot of things about Rails, you know, and like Anjay was always mentioning you can start a project really fast and you can get you know, something up and running really fast, and that's true and that's cool, and it also unites a lot of people. I mean, we're all here literally because of Rails in a way. My problem has always been that I didn't find enough abstraction layers. You know, I like complicated stuff. I like Java. I also like JRuby, and I like Enterprise. So actually, I don't like Enterprise, and I have no idea what it means, but it sounds cool. So my problem in Ruby was that I was striving to find additional layers that help me model complex applications, and I actually could not find them in Rails, and I still can't find them. So this microphone, is that actually working? Because it keeps skipping here. Okay, great. Because we are all professionals. So my main problem was, how do I solve specific problems not in the controller and not in the model and not in the view? I mean, who would solve problems in views? Views are supposed to be logicless, right? So to cut this long, like I used to have a really long introduction for that, like how Rails and blah, 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 blah. I decided to ditch all that because there's lots of people who saw parts of this presentation already. So to cut this short, I discovered a pattern I really liked, the service object. So Anjay was mentioning that this is one of the, like, it's like the magic silver bullet in Ruby. Like, we always talk about the service object. I actually just call it object, but because an object is supposed to do something, and that is a service, so let's just call it object. So it turned out that objects in Ruby are something people are really scared of. It's like, oh my God, you're introducing some abstraction layer. Like
like how are you supposed to solve something not in the controller or in the model? Like, isn't it going to be slow because it's a new object? So a couple of years, you're all laughing, but a couple of years ago, it was actually a thing to introduce additional objects that are not models in a Rails application. So I really fell in love with the, like, when the Ruby community started to talk about service objects, I was praying to the God of Ruby, saying, thank you that we finally arrived at a state where we talk about architecture and software design properly. And in this beautiful project called Trailblazer, we kind of have like a standard implementation called operation, a standard implementation for a service object, sorry. And what the operation does is literally it takes one function of your application, like creating a comment or, I don't know, moderating or like storing a review about your website or something like that. So one function of your application is encapsulated in one service object. And in that object, there are lots of other objects involved, yeah? And it's up to the designer of that operation. So Trailblazer gives you a lot of existing functionality to streamline what is going on. But you, like, the fact that you have one object representing one function of your application, that was not a normal thing 5 years ago in Ruby. Like, people were constantly arguing, this should be happening in a controller action and in the model because it's MVC, and MVC means you have to have really messy code. Because if it's not messy, it's not MVC. So FIFO, like maybe even less, like a couple of years ago, having a dedicated object for one function of your application was completely crazy. Yeah. So what we kind of managed to get people to think about in Trailblazer is, okay, I have one object doing one thing in my application. And the result was that controller actions were becoming really simple. Yeah. So usually one controller action would just trigger or invoke one operation. And you know, don't worry about the call method and all that kind of stuff. My point is, there is only very little code specific to HTTP and specific to rendering in the controller, and then you delegate that to a separate object. Oh my God, a new object. Ah. And that object is supposed to do everything necessary to create a comment in my example, yeah? And it doesn't mean it has to do that in one object. It can delegate that to other objects. So the God object argument doesn't work here. And another thing we did in Trailblazer that was really interesting was we started to use namespacing properly, yeah? So you can see the name of the object or the class is common : create. So you read that and you know this is probably not going to delete a comment, it's going to create a comment because the name is create. So we kind of started to introduce subject or the domain object name, : the verb, what is going to happen. And we use the call method because we don't, like, this class has only one public method, and that's the call method. And you can't invoke any other methods on that thing. So you're basically calling a function that is creating a comment. And as I already said, you have several, like you have one operation per function in your application. Yes, you use, it's not only CRUD, you don't only create or delete stuff. You can do, you know, as I say, like archive, or you can use an operation for a sign-in function and all this kind of stuff. So you basically transform your controller actions into operations. So that's the basic idea. And what's really cool is that you can test that unit tests. So you don't have to have HTTP stack tests running all over your stack and taking a lot of time. You can test your functionality in a beautiful unit test. I actually really like testing. And unit tests are much faster than going through the whole HTTP thing. The other great thing is by encapsulating that function, creating a comment, deleting a user, into an object, you can use that as a factory. So in order to create a testable application state, and they can be really complicated, you just call a chain of operations and you have the exact same state that you have when you click through your application. Yeah, but so it's simple, it's just encapsulation. You just put that code into some object and not in the controller and in the model and somewhere else. And then that allows you to have really beautiful tests. So I use that we use operations as factories as well. It's very beautiful. So I did a really big mistake in my career enterprise. So I started writing a book about Trailblazer while I was working on Trailblazer. And that book appeared, And people, like the book title is a new architecture for Rails. The book title is not a new architecture for Rails that is going to solve all your problems and write code automatically and you don't have to do anything anymore because Trailblazer is brilliant. Yeah, so people, they see a book and they assume the project is perfect and everything's going to work and it's great and there's no problems. So people started downloading, reading the book while we were working on the project, and it was so messy because every time we changed API, guess what happened? I have to rewrite. I had to rewrite parts of the book, and sometimes I wrote chapters of that book, and then I realized actually the API sucks. Like this is really bad. Like I want to redesign this, so I went back to the library, rewrote stuff, and then you have to rewrite the book. It's terrible. Like don't. If I can give you one advice, write books. It's amazing, but write books about stuff that are kind of presentable. Okay. And that's the only thing I want to tell you. Goodbye. Okay. So in the first version of Trailblazer with the operation, the service object, there was one major, excuse my language, fuck up. And the fuck up was that I designed the API wrong. Yes, that happens. So you have this service object comment create or something, and then there's one method called process. And in that process method, you would do all the stuff necessary to create whatever, to do whatever you have to do, archive something, delete something, whatever. And I knew this is wrong, but I was already excited to have people using service objects in a standardized way. Okay, so for you it sounds like crazy. Why did you do the process method? But I was already happy to have people using like objects for something specific. So that was the mission of Trailblazer. And the process method was like in all the projects, it became really messy really quickly. Yeah, because you have to do like if, else, blah. Trailblazer gave you lots of helpful methods to like validate a form object or something like that, but still there was a lot of code, so it was wrong. Yeah, and I like this. This is a GIMP tool. I really like it. So what do you do when something is wrong? You should fix it. I mean, Trailblazer is not Rails. We're not going to keep the same API for 10 years and say it's awesome because we made 200 million with our product Basecamp. So what I did is I started to talk to people. Also, I started talking to Anjay, who's also some person, by the way. And so I went on GitHub, chatting with random people. And for some reason, I got intrigued by the idea of like monads. It's like a functional concept where you chain functions and you can handle edge cases with like mathematical, super complex bullshit. And I was really intrigued. Awesome. And then I had a couple of whiskeys. And I decided, okay, I'm going to switch from object-oriented to functional programming. No bullshit. But I just thought maybe using new concepts from other languages is not the worst. And I discovered something, it's called the railway, and you probably have seen a million blog posts about it already. So the idea of a railway is you have a success track, the upper one, and a failure track. And as you can see, you place your steps on that railway, and if something goes wrong, I'm not sure if I have, so in normal case, you would just go through all the steps necessary to do whatever you need. If there is something going wrong, it will switch to the failure track and only execute the stuff on the failure track, skipping the rest on your success track. So it's kind of like a mechanic to save you a lot of, I know it's very beautiful. It's like, I'm really good with GIMP. I can repeat it like 100 times if you want. So it's a mechanic to take away flow control code and kind of standardize the way your control flow works. Yeah, and it has different outcomes. Like you can, the basic idea is you skip the rest on the remaining steps on the success track if something goes wrong in a step. Whatever goes wrong means, it doesn't matter. And as always, someone already invented this. So I just checked the web and I saw railway-oriented programming, and it's like totally a thing in all the functional languages, not in Ruby. And I decided let's use that approach to solve the problem. So again, the problem was we had super messy process methods. Yeah, if, else, blah, handle this, edge case, alert, rescue, whatever. So in 1.1, messy, people were yelling at me. In 2.0, we introduced that railway, and you can already imagine, I mean, you just saw that diagram, and basically what this DSL does is creating a control flow structure in the background for you that looks exactly like this diagram we just saw. This is, yeah, hi, here you are. Good to see you. So the problem was I changed the API, yeah, and it's like in Ruby you shouldn't change APIs because people want to have the same API for like 100 years. This is why Rails has never changed. So people were actually yelling at me. So, okay, the idea was let's make this MEST process method simpler, okay? Let's give people a tool to restructure their code in a better way. And all you get are people yelling at you saying, why the fuck did you change the API? I'm looking at you. So yeah, this is a lesson. Like, I used to be really careless with API changes. I just changed them and I didn't realize that people are actually using that stuff. So, but after a couple of days, or actually sometimes it was only hours, people would see, oh, it actually helps. That's actually an API change that makes my life better. Nick Sutterer, changing API since whatever. So there's lots of other gems, not only Trailblazer, doing a great job with implementing railways and monads and this kind of control flow structure. There's dry transaction, which is great. There is active interactor, which lots of people probably use. They all have the same goal. So there's a really good blog post that popped up a few days ago. This is where this tweet is here. I don't understand the concept of links in slides. That's why I put a tweet in the slide. So lots of people use that concept of restructuring, like taking away the need to do a lot of Ruby programming for control flow and using DSLs instead, because DSLs in Ruby are actually really cool. Some really cool features we have in Trailblazer that are not present in Dry or in Active Interactor are that you can do nesting really simple. Yeah, let's say I want to have the save step replaced with something more complex. Yeah, for example, like I want to use ROM and a change set or something, and that requires to be another operation with its own railway. Again, you can nest that using the nested macro. So like composing more complex control flows is really simple. And it gets this plus thing in the diagram language I'm going to describe in a second. And another thing is you can have more complex wiring. Yeah, you see this new path going out of the nested step, for example. So again, we have like a super simple DSL that helps you to handle those cases. And like every time I show this kind of stuff, people start laughing. Like, why would you do that? Like, why would you have something like more complex than a railway? And the answer is, again, because you need it. Sometimes you don't want to have a linear flow. Sometimes you want to have more complex things being handled by your code, and that's exactly what the DSL gives you. Another thing that's really important is that we have something called tracing. So you can see the flow and what happened and what path the execution took, yeah? So if it went wrong, if it went right, and you can actually see the ingoing and outgoing values of your environment, we call it context, that are present before and after every step. When I say step, I mean a box, basically. Yeah, so that's really cool for debugging, and that's like a feature all the other gems didn't even consider. And actually, tracing the implementation of tracing urged us to do a lot of refactoring and then rewrote everything. And it doesn't matter. But Trailblazer 2.1 is here and it does tracing, and it only took 1.5 years. Only for tracing, of course. Another really cool feature is that you can have like template operations that predefining very common flows. For example, like authenticating, authorizing the user, and then validating something, and then saving something. But you can insert your own steps into template methods, or you can just insert your own implementation of those steps. So you can basically replace the implementation of an existing control flow. So it's very dry. Like you don't have to redefine control flows that you use in a lot of places. Don't worry if you don't understand the code. I don't understand it either. So this is kind of where we were with Trailblazer, let's say 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. So we had this railway thing, we had operations. We managed to make people use service objects, standardized service objects, not 15 different service object implementation in one application, because I've seen that. We had people to talk in like more domain-specific language. They were talking about like verbs and domain entities, TDD. because operations want to be named like DDD. So people were actually thinking about their control flows more because they were like thinking in steps, and that was really cool. But of course, that's not enough. Like we could just retire and say, here, this is a Trailblazer, go with it. The problem is that I discovered something called BPMN. Yeah, I told you I'm really good with GIMP. I have more animations coming, so stay tuned. So the problem was that I got arrested. No, actually, I started working in a consulting project for the German police because they used Trailblazer. It's a really funny fact. And yeah, I'm still laughing. And so the problem was that they had thousands of documents, thousands of folders with descriptions of this is the workflow of that process and that is the workflow of that process for, you know, like background checks on criminals or the way you kind of do driver license checks and all this kind of stuff. Millions of documents describing the code. So they use Ruby for a lot of checking code. And I'm actually trying to make them use JRuby. Charles, where are you? Somewhere? Oh, here we go. And so lots of documents describing workflows, lots of code that has absolutely zero to do with the actual, like with the designed workflows. There's so much code that does if and else and blah and checks state of models and makes sure that you can't get into that state if that happened. So the problem was it's completely out of sync, like their documentation and their code completely screwed up. And but I was intrigued by this language, like the diagram language. And that's, I found out this is called BPMN, Business Process Modeling Notation, from the Java community. And it's been there for like 30 years and is in version 2.0. And it's basically only a standard to define processes, yeah, business processes. It's super simple, really, it's so simple. It has boxes, circles, arrows, squares, and vomiting unicorns. Just kidding here, there's no squares in BPMN, there are only rectangles. Okay, so it's like, if you look at BPMN diagrams, come on, it wasn't that good. If you look at BPMN diagrams, it's really obvious what is happening. I mean, you don't have to understand the millions of functions they have and all the specifications and everything. Like, what intrigued me was I look at this and I can see something is going that way, yeah, and something is happening and there's probably some stops or suspense in the between time or whatever, but it's super obvious, and I really love visual, like visualization of problems. And they also have the concept of like nesting. So one of those boxes here, those big boxes, rectangles, is called activity, and they have the ability to nest activities. So basically like programming when you call a function. And they have some really cool concept, and that's something where Andre should start listening instead of sleeping. That's called events. So events can be throwing, that's when you have a dark icon, and events can be listening for something, and that's when you have like a white envelope. So that means I'm waiting for something to happen. And I was really struggling with BPMN to understand events because, I mean, I can't even remember how I confused it, because an event for me was something that happens and then it changes state. But in BPMN, it's literally just, if we meet this circle, we will throw an event and keep going, and someone else in this whole business process might be listening for that event, and that's when you trigger this guy down here. And that's the idea of events in BPMN. I mean, you can go and read the 578 pages of specification if you want, plus 313 pages about the XML specification. We all love XML, I know. But this is literally everything you need to know about BPMN, like on the formal side, yeah? And I'm not an expert at all. Like I just know that you have those arrows and you connect stuff and you have events that can trigger other activities or continue other activities. They have one concept I was not explaining that's called a lane. So that's how you structure activities in a more domain-oriented way. So a lane usually represents a participant. You can see I'm really enterprise with my vocabulary, right? Like all the BPMN terms, but that's it. Like I don't know more about it, but it's awesome. So the thing was, I discovered BPMN. I had the police code, and I had Trailblazer in a like kind of way that I just described. And I realized actually what we're doing in Trailblazer is kind of like we're implementing a part of BPMN. Yeah, I mean, I didn't write Trailblazer to implement BPMN because that's bullshit. That's what people in Java do, and the frameworks are super complex. So what we had is a really simple orchestration framework for control flow. We already have the ability to nest things, and we didn't have events, but kind of I saw a huge similarity to BPMN, and it took away the pain I would have had if I had invented my own drawing language. And also I want to be enterprise. So what we did next was we decided to keep going with what we have, but we add more BPMN specific features to Trailblazer, and that's when the workflow gem came up. So the workflow gem is something you will not find on GitHub because we decided to be enterprise assholes and make it a paid gem. So currently it's a private GitLab repo because we don't want to spend money on the private repository on GitHub. Hey, it's all about money. So yeah, so the workflow gem is probably going to be published as a real project, but like as an open source public project. It is still open source, but not free. Currently, we're using it for the police, and if you look for it, you won't find it, and that's good. So the idea in workflow is that you have operations, you know, like your controller functions in a more specific way, and you chain them together in longer running processes, you know. So here is an example for a one-time password login. Like I don't know if you know the process, but usually like it's the same when you forget your password. Like you say, hey, give me a one-time password, and then the user takes that password and they enter. I don't know if I have animations yet. So this is another amazing GIMP thing I did. So you generate that one-time password, send it to the user. The user at some point will enter that one-time password, and you check it. If it's okay, you require the user to change the password. And if you require the user to change, oh sorry, this is not in this workflow, but like you basically define the chain of actions a user can do, and you do not allow to, for example, change the password before they enter the correct one-time password. Like it's super simple. And what we did in workflow was we added events, so we can basically implement long-running processes. So it's exactly like an operation. We start here, we call whatever we do in the generate OTP box, there's some Ruby code run, and then we hit that circle with a dark envelope, and that means we trigger an event and say, hey, by the way, we created a one-time password. And then we hit the next circle, which is an envelope with like a white envelope, which means I'm waiting for some response, and that's when the process stops, okay? And there's no like magic session handling or something running in the background. This is really just, I'm going to show you some code later and you will understand. So what I'm doing here is I define the workflow for signing in with a one-time password, and that's a workflow in a library. Yeah? In a new gem we wrote Tyrant. It's probably also going to be paid gem because it's great to have like closed source. Awesome, enterprise.com. So that workflow is defined in a gem. Yeah. And that's a cool thing I learned about BPMN a few weeks ago, or months ago actually, is that you can have library workflows that define generic workflow that you can use in lots of other parts of your application. And you can have concrete workflows connected to that that are mapping to functions in your application. I'm showing an example in a second. So, hey, this is GIMP skills, come on. I mean, do you want, do you think it looks better with a galaxy background? Do you want a galaxy background? Ah! So the whole idea of workflows is you execute any change or step you want and you throw events until you hit a catching event, like a listening event, and then you stop. And what you do after that is up to you. So the whole idea is execute something, stop, let someone trigger this specific event and continue from there. So that's the generic, that's a workflow in a nutshell. And those workflows are not like crazy, like super crazy stuff. It's just you use basically the same DSL you use for an operation, and you just have this suspend method that defines events that are listening. Actually, this is completely like random code I punched in yesterday just to show something. It actually doesn't work like that, but it doesn't matter. And to show you an example how that looks in an application. So there's not like a Java engine running in the background or something. I would love to have that. It's really just you, instead of calling operations or service objects in your controller actions, you only throw events. Events. Anjay? Events. Oh, okay. Do you have a good photo of me? Do you want me to? So instead of calling your service object manually, you say, hey, workflow engine, or process engine, sorry, please trigger a specific event. For example, in this case, I'm triggering the start event to start the process you just saw. So it doesn't matter if you don't understand all the details. The key thing I want to tell you is you do not call your code manually. You let the process engine decide what and where to continue given a specific event. And what's really cool is that in BPMN, what I was already hinting, there's something called a collaboration activity. And a collaboration is using something like a library workflow, you know, that defines the generic workflow for, let's say, a one-time password login, or I don't know, like it can be anything. You can model anything as a workflow. And I connect that to an actual, why is this cut off? Oh, I'm not professional. So then you connect that to an actual application workflow. So the upper box you see is a specific use case for that workflow in my application. I was actually trying to make the Galaxy again, but it looks really shitty. So yeah, this is where my GIMP skills hit the limits. And the idea of a collaboration diagram is, and again, don't worry if it like feels messy and you don't understand everything of the events and everything. So what you do in a collaboration activity is you connect events from a library workflow, the lower one, to an actual workflow in your application. And that way you can kind of customize and implement and add features to that workflow. I have some like quick example for that, but the idea really fascinates me that you connect different activities via events, and it allows you to extend, to change, but you always rely on your library workflow that defines the rules for that control flow without having to do a lot of if and else in your code. It's amazing. So let's say I start my application workflow. Just to remind you, I want to create a user, create a one-time password, give that one-time password to the user. User signs in with the one-time password. If it's correct, change your password. If it's not correct, go fuck off. So, so in my application workflow, what I do is I start. That's where the paprika is. It's also a GIMP brush filter. I couldn't find anything else. Capsicum, as they say in Australia. So I start the workflow. I go create the user with an operation, for example. Then I trigger an event that says, hey, I'm ready for a one-time password. That's the rocket going down to the actual library workflow. And then the library workflow will generate a one-time password, hits the event and says, hey, I'm done with the one-time password, here you go. So actually there's no event system in Trailblazer, there's no like messages sending around. This is just like the mental model are events, but we don't have like an eventing system yet. Okay, so I'm using my library workflow to create a one-time password. I hit the empty envelope, and that means I'm going to wait. And that means my request is done. So what happened just now was you create a user in a controller action, maybe from an admin interface or something. You create a user, you generate a one-time password via the event, via the workflow, and you're done. And then you display that one-time password on the screen in the browser, and the user the admin will say, hey, by the way, user, I just created you. Your one-time password is 12345. So that's the workflow. That's what the police does currently with their administrators. And then the user signs in. So what does the user do? Open the browser. I don't know, police.de/login. Don't try it. It's not. And they will see a form saying, please enter your one-time password. And so I'm going to show an example in a second. And so basically, what you do when you enter the one-time password is you trigger the next event. Here's again, the collaboration is nothing crazy. Like you could use the exact same DSL or the same style to define this in Ruby. And you use the exact same mechanism to trigger collaboration. So I'm just throwing an event into my collaboration class via the workflow engine, and this will know where to continue or where to start, okay? Yeah, just the example I was just trying to finish is that when the user logs in with their one-time password, this is where the process engine will continue from the state it stopped. And so again, the idea is the workflow engine knows where you are. You throw an event into the workflow engine, and it will continue to process whatever it does. And it will trigger events, call the library workflow again. The library workflow will do whatever it has to do and communicate that back to your applications. It's super simple, and it's like really nicely in visual form, so I kind of understand what I'm doing. It's all based on like calling the process engine in your controller actions. Again, like I'm keep repeating this because people always think there's like some magic going on in the background. You are responsible for your session handling. You are saying, I want to serialize this and that between requests, but the process engine will take care of the rest. So you don't have to worry about is it okay to render the change password form in that case, because the process engine will know if it's okay to render the change password form or not, because the process engine knows, are we actually in that state, or are we still in the, I don't know, one-time password generation process? And that has like reduced the code in the police code base. There were, I'm guessing like 60 to 70% was only control flow code. It was always like if model dot state equals, I don't know, allowed, and if model dot created at smaller than 200, well, it doesn't make sense, but you get the idea. And if inquiry dot state equals this and that, so there was so much control code, and then they started to add more code to like hack and fix stuff. And it was impossible to look at the code and say, this is actually happening. Like, you know, the one-time password sign-up process, the implementation was like thousands of lines of code, and we were able to reduce that stepwise using this workflow engine. And the funny thing was, it worked. So Trailblazer 2.1 gives you those new workflow things I just showed, and I hopefully confused the shit out of everyone. So what we added in 2.1 is like the super generic mechanics to build workflows. Yeah, Trailblazer doesn't care if it's a long-running process or if it's just an operation for a controller action. You have mechanics to build any kind of graph you want. And we have this beautiful new feature with the collaboration diagram, so you can compose more complex workflows using either nesting, by nesting operations or activities, or by using the collaboration where you have those arrows between different lanes. And then all you do is have an event, throw it into the process engine. The process engine will figure out where to continue. And you don't have to care about what will happen when. It's pretty amazing. And so I actually found out that I'm pretty enterprise now because I'm like using service objects. I'm wearing a suit every day, and I use BPMN, and BPMN is Java, so it must be enterprise. If you look at enterprise, the definition, it actually only means that you satisfy the needs of an organization rather than individual users. I didn't know, I don't know if you know that. It's on Wikipedia. So we're all writing enterprise software. So there's no point in not using cool features. One thing I want to really quickly mention is that Anjay's talk was about like domain-driven design and event sourcing. And you might think like, oh my God, they are throwing so many different words in the room with like events and whatever. Like the stuff I was showing, BPMN does not exclude something like event sourcing, for example. It actually embraces the same idea. Yeah, you connect. BPMN and Trailblazer is how do I orchestrate my control flow, and event sourcing is about one part of event sourcing is building up this historical database, and that's what most people think is event sourcing. But in my view, event sourcing is more about like the way you design your system by defining events and triggering those events, and that is completely exactly the same that BPMN does. So I think you and I should have a beer tonight. I mean, it's not that we wouldn't have a beer, but you know, whatever. One cool thing is that we have a graphical editor coming up. It's also paid, of course, like nothing is free anymore. So you can render and you can draw graphs and activities and whatever, collaboration diagrams. It's pretty amazing. You can use it as a trace. You can visualize your tracing, like what happened in my process. You can visualize that in the editor, and you can also use it for debugging. So it's something like, and that's really amazing. Like I can't show an example because it doesn't work yet. But hey, it's open source. Come on. So if something happens in some really deeply nested activity and there's an exception raised, you can actually, so Trailblazer catches that exception and has a stack trace and has the trace of the diagram, so it can visualize where that exception actually happened visually, and that's amazing. And you don't have that in Ruby, and you will never have that in Ruby. So you know where you are, on what level, and you know what happened, and you have all the environment variables, of course. And this is a really shitty slide. This is probably the worst slide I've ever had. I just wanted to mention that. Don't break the lights, okay? Thank you. So we also have like lots of new features coming out. For example, you can have input and output contracts, we call it. So you can say in that box, when the arrow goes in, the environment has to be like this and that. And when the box is finished and the arrow goes out, the environment has to be like this and that. So you can define what context is in the content is in the context object, difficult word. So we basically, yeah, there's like, it helps you to scope your steps and to define inputs and outputs. It's really simple. And the most amazing thing is we have really good testing abilities. Like you can test those complicated workflows in unit tests or in integration tests. And it's super, super fast and really solid. Like the application we just wrote is completely tested. All the edge cases, we're going online in 10 days or something. And then I will probably tweet, shit! But yeah. Okay, so my journey my journey ends being finding out that I'm pretty enterprise. I actually don't have a problem with it. I think it's a good thing to embrace, you know, new technology and ideas that we don't have in Ruby. Like no one in Ruby talks about BPMN because we think, oh, it's from Java. It's terrible. Like, oh, it's all about like, you know, quick and prototyping and everything. Like, no, I don't want to prototype. I want to write solid applications that are maintainable, that are fun to work with in 5 years and 10 years from now. I don't want to write a quick blog post application in 5 minutes and impress my grandmother or something like that. So I think being, you know, writing enterprise solid software is nothing wrong. So I urge you to embrace the new ideas we have. I also urge you to buy me a drink tonight. But before you buy me a drink, you have to go to that URL. That is Ivan's survey on your state of mind in association with Rails. Or in other words, how much do you hate Rails? That's in this survey, and he asked me to put that in the talk to get a better idea. And I think there's lots of people here, so please all go to that URL. This is the end of my talk. I'm Nick, Enterprise Sutterer, and you were awesome. Thank you so much.
So
I
guys,
forgot we have questions.
2 or 3 questions, if you have.
Everyone is like...
Okay, you can ask Nick at the... we
have lots of questions.
Yeah.
So how do you find...
Where are you? Here. Hi.
Here. I'll come closer. How hard do you find to promote new approaches, new frameworks in the Ruby world? I mean, 15 years ago, there was nothing. Then there was Rails. Mm-hmm. Are you competing with Rails these days?
And so Trailblazer is not, or the stuff I was showing is absolutely not. We are competing in Rails in a way that we claim we have the better way to structure business code.
Exactly.
So all the code in Rails, and not all the code. So Trailblazer runs with Rails, with Hanami, with Rhoda, whatever. Like we just say, there's good routing frameworks like Rails. There's good rendering stuff like not Rails. And we care about how do you orchestrate the business logic. Yeah, what happens after the request is intercepted by the controller, and what happens before the stuff is persisted to the database. So that's what I define business code. So we are not competing. I mean, I don't like the Rails way, and I think I've mentioned that about 500 times in my life in conferences. But I don't think that using Rails with additional layers is wrong. Like, I don't want to rewrite Rails as an example. And I think Active Record, especially the query interface, is amazing. I don't like the writing interface, but that's a different story. So there's no competition going on. We want to extend what we have.
Okay, one of my team members, we're moving off Bonita. I don't know if you know which is BPMN implementation.
What's the project's name?
I work for FLab. It's a French company. They sell AdWords campaign. So.
And you need consulting, you're saying, right? I mean, I'm busy with the police, but I can send you one of my.
I only pay in beers.
Well, that's great.
Yep. See you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
One more question from me, Nick.
Hello.
Hello. I'm here. Thank you. It was. Yeah. I am not so tall.
We call it concurrency.
Where are you? Here, okay.
I am a little bit hiding, sorry.
Yeah, and there's a bright spot.
During all presentation, I was counting you have said trailblazing much more less than on the last presentation I have been on, so it is dramatic changes. What happens?
You mean what happened to the library or to my slides?
Actually, I see that slides almost the same was.
Yes, I also said almost the same. Even the jokes. No, I removed. So I removed all the shit jokes from the talk. That's why you didn't recognize it, probably.
So in any case, it's better, yeah?
Thanks, awesome.
And last question, please.
Okay, yeah. So I have read all your manuals since 2015, and that's why I have followed all the API changes. And actually, I have changed my projects a couple of times already.
So you're using it?
Sorry?
So you're using the old version of Trailblazer? Are you saying that, or you just?
Yes. So since version 1, you're using it.
Sorry to hear that.
Okay, yeah. Actually, yes. So I wanted to clarify. So collaboration, it wouldn't be free. You do not plan currently to have a free version of collaboration these classes, yeah?
Yeah, I mean the paid stuff I'm talking about is really just very currently it's edge case. So my problem is I want to make Ruby people think more about that they are using a lot of gems and it costs shit tons of money to create those gems. So so operation, everything will be free. Activity, the gem, everything will be free. The workflow gem might be, it's LGPL version 3, and it's so you have to buy a license, but I think it's also going to be free. So we're not planning to take over the world and become Nestle 2.0 or something. We are just trying to there has to be a change in open source in general. Like people use and use and use, and you complain about stuff and bugs, and this feature is missing, and I hate you. And you're like, cool, man, I am writing this shit in my free time, and you complain about it, like you. So we kind of try. The idea is to make people more aware of this, and people start giving a crap as soon as they pay money. That's bizarre, but it's the way I found out with.
Yeah, so actually, I'm completely okay with it, because honestly speaking, right now, I'm thinking that it's rather complex, and maybe I would better go with event sourcing than with this. But only one thing, I wanted just maybe to reach you out in this way, to say that operations, maybe they require a little bit more straightforward error handling. Because as I remember, in first version, it was a little bit easier to get errors.
Yeah, but that was because you were writing your own code basically. So what the problem? I agree with you. So the tracing, I mean, I didn't show it. I just showed some stupid green arrows in the diagram. So you can, when an error happens with the new developer gem, you can really see where and what's the environment like. So finding an error will be actually simpler than it was in 1.1, where you had to do it yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.